Not all dads read books, but the dads that do, like big doorstopper, big brick daddies of books. So even though I'm not a father, and with the Father's Day coming up, I thought my good another video would be uh, top 10 book recommendations for dads or uncles, or dad core. Big doorstops of books, for some reason, appeal to dads. Now, some of the obvious topics, the Civil War, World War II, we've got these in here, and I'm going to leave out some that might be too obvious. So, John Adams by Dave McCulloch, Band of Brothers by Stephen Ambrose. Admittedly, those are a little short. So, the only real category, the only real um, requirements for this list are being interesting, appealing to dads, and being big old thick books. And as always, don't forget to research these on your own because research is optional but important. Let's move right along. There's something I really like. Again, I read all kinds of books, and I've almost always got at least 5 or 6 different books going. I'll have an easy read like a sci-fi or a mystery, just like popcorn book. I've usually got a couple of scientific books. Then I've got specific books that are about the research I'm doing or the writing I'm doing, whatever project I have going on. Then I've got, that giant doorstopper of a novel that I'm always trying to get through right now. It's You Bright and Risen Angels by William Vollman, back here somewhere. Um, I'm slowly working my way through the 12 volume collected set of all of Henry James's tales, which are his short stories and his like novellas. And that's been enlightening, but not necessarily enlivening. It's taking a while, but there is something. I've almost always got a big old thick Dadcore biography that's like beyond the scope of a regular biography that encompasses the whole era, or looks at things in a new light. And so, even though again I don't have any children of my own besides animals, I think I'm somewhat of an honorary expert on Dadcore and dad books. I certainly have an affinity for dad jokes. So let's go ahead and get down to the list, starting off with one that's a little bit out of my wheelhouse usually. It's book 10, Children of Ash and Elm, History of the Vikings by Neil Price. Um, I actually listened to this audiobook version. It just popped up on my Libby recommendations somewhere, and it ticked a lot of boxes for me. It was a big, thick history book, and this time about an area that I'm not usually that interested in. Part of the reason is because a lot of the books about this era are just about the raiding and just about the Vikings, and some of them lean a little bit toward troubling concerns about purity and all these things, as well as an often disconcerting framework of Vikings and any pre-Christian or any pre-Christian civilizations or civilizations that were formative or form or well formed already around early Christendom. A lot of times these older histories will call the Vikings heathens, and that they didn't really develop until they got that early exposure to Christianity, and they're just very one-sided. Um, Neil Price here is a professor of anthropology, specifically archaeology, and he looked at a lot of contemporary research. The book's, I want to say, 5 or 6 years old. A lot of contemporary evidence and new archaeological research data, and he breaks the book into 3 sections. So it's not just about the. I mean, there is the classic raiding and looting and pillaging, but there's also the early shamanism of Vikings, not just the standard Norse myths that get pounded and pounded again and again in all these books. I think this one will appeal to dads because it's a big old book about Vikings. Um, a lot of dads and people in general have this fascination with the all the different Viking shows on various streaming services. But I think this one not only is well written and engaging, it's one of the first that I've attempted, much less finished, about the subject that gives a really nice portrait and expansive one rather than just making the Viking era seem like people with bullhorns on their helmets raiding and pillaging. There's a lot to it, and the writing is really top notch. Number 9, you got to have a World War II book in any respectable list for dads. Um, and this is a doozy. There are a lot of big door stoppers about World War II. So what I've done is I've stuck kind of with the biography angle, and I've chosen for number 9 Churchill, Walking with History by Andrew Roberts. This book is literally a door stopper. I mean, it is, I think, 1,200 pages plus notes. They really probably could have broken it into a few volumes. Um, but suffice to say, Churchill's life demands that. I mean, there have been hundreds and hundreds of books, if not more, written about Churchill. I mean, he won the Nobel Prize for literature. He oversaw the successful comeback and victory of England against relentless bombing from Hitler and the Third Reich. Came back out of retirement again to be prime minister later, and he was always busy. He was a painter, he was a bulldog, he was a warrior, he was a beloved husband. He really is just a fascinating guy, and I think I've read, I'd say, probably 10 books directly about Churchill, and then dozens, if not hundreds, about the era. And this is one of the best volumes about Churchill I've read. It's not the most, it's not a thriller. It's not necessarily a quick read, but it's engrossing, and it has all those qualities I like in a big, thick book. I can open it up, read either 10 pages or 100 pages, and I get so much information. I learn things even about events that I'm already familiar with. Churchill is the goat of World War II, and this is, I would say, the goat of Churchill biographies. And again, any biography of Churchill is going to focus so much on World War II that it'll scratch that itch for your Dadcore World War II obsessions. Next, I'd say one of the most common affinities for Dadcore books, uh, books your dad might like for Father's Day, or you might like if you're a dad or have dad tendencies like me, is the Civil War. Now, the Civil War, there's lots of great books and lots of controversial books, lots of books that are really boring. Again, there are libraries and bookstores full of books about the Civil War. Instead, from that era, why not give dad one that focuses on a pivotal character who doesn't always get much time of day outside of his history with being an enslaved person? And of course, we're talking about Frederick Douglass in David W. Blight's Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. This is a big, thick bookstopper of a book that is written by a Yale professor who's an expert on Frederick Douglass's life and also American literature, and particularly the history and literature of African Americans. This book won the Pulitzer Prize for history or for autobiography. I cannot remember. And for me, Douglass, having read his autobiographies and seeing him peripherally in so many other works, often, like I said, gets pigeonholed, and they only talk about his, inspirational path to freedom and teaching himself to read and all that. This book not only accesses a lot of his writings and other papers that necessarily, they weren't newly discovered, but they were fairly newly discovered, and they hadn't been explored that much in print, especially not in this level of detail. So we also have a lot of information from Frederick Douglass's newspaper days, especially since there were a lot of newspapers that were fairly recently unearthed that just weren't available until the last few decades, or maybe even sooner. So this book not only shows Douglass's pivotal role in the development of civil rights after the Civil War and abolition of slavery, but also his complex personal dynamics, his battles with theology and the Christian faith, especially in the the morass of a Christian nation that was enslaving people, which was something obviously he thought, and most of us today, hopefully, agree was a horrible outrage and sin, regardless of your religious background. Um, the book shows his multiple marriages, his complex family life. He was really a fascinating guy, arguably um, just as powerful a writer and speaker as even Abraham Lincoln. Although, of course, Lincoln gets a lot of the credit, Frederick Douglass was certainly right along there. If we call the Civil War era a new founding of America or restructuring of America, there would be impossible to say that Frederick Douglass wouldn't be one of those founding fathers of the new America. Again, a great book, well written. It's not as beautifully written as like Children of Ash and Elm, but again, it's the guy knows what he's doing. History professors, when they write these books for these big five companies, when they get like Dave McCullough, um, other guys like that, they usually know what they're doing. They're great storytellers, and they're the professor you'd have loved to have because they knew so much about their topic and loved it. So Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, it is probably a safe bet to give to most dads that are into the Civil War era, and it might show them a different perspective. So number 6 is um, by an author that you've probably either heard of his books or musicals that were inspired by his books. Ron Chernobyl, spoiler, is Washington, A Life by Ron Chernow. This is a big Pulitzer Prize winning book by Ron Chernow, who was primarily a journalist, and he sort of became almost like an autodidact historian, has become known now for writing really respected biographies and historical works. He previously won the National Book Award for something else, and his previous book to Washington was Hamilton, which was one of the first really big blockbuster books about Alexander Hamilton that showed him in a more complex, different light, and actually inspired Lin-Manuel Miranda to write the famous Hamilton musical. That book's great. Your Dadcore history buff papa might have already read it. And if not, I just think Washington is a more fascinating book because Washington had been covered so much. People already had this conception of who he was as a man, that he was just a stoic, almost mythical feature. And I think this book and portrays Washington as a more complex, changing, always improving person. It really digs into a lot of his personal writings. We don't really think necessarily of George Washington as having been much of a writer or artist or man of letters of any way like some of the other founding fathers. But Washington wrote a lot, and it was overwhelmingly sort of self-teaching. He was trying to improve. He made a lot of mistakes. Washington made a lot of mistakes. And I went through a Dadcore phase, where I read about 50 books about George Washington and even more about the era. And there are tons of books that are all boring snooze factories that are even shorter than this. And this is a big old book, sure to scratch an itch for the dad in any reader, but also just really turns Washington in a new light and shows him as a multifaceted character. Again, really thought-provoking book. He also has 2 other big thick daddies that I haven't read yet, but I really want to. One's about Grant, and one's about Ulysses Grant, president, and one's about Mark Twain. I already ticked the Civil War box, but to call the book about Frederick Douglass a Civil War book does Mr. Douglass a disservice. And again, there's another book that's an absolute must-read for anybody with even an inkling of interest in American history. It really should be required reading for anyone. It's by one of the powerhouse historians of the last 50 years. It's Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals. Team of Rivals is a story of Abraham Lincoln, how he got elected, his background. It's a story of his life, but its primary focus is how he assembled a cabinet from the people who were actively running against him, who he beat kind of against the odds, against the historical expectations to get the presidency. And he assembled a lot of these people who were formerly his enemies into his cabinet. This led to him having a very sometimes contentious, but also very collaborative White House. And when he was making the decisions for these pivotal things related to the Civil War, the abolition of slavery, concessions and things like that, he got this really, really diverse, flexible kind of school of thought in his cabinet rather than just all yes men. The book is fascinating. Doris Kearns Goodwin, I don't know how she does it, but they read so well. All of her books, I haven't read all of them, but I've read many. Her book about Lyndon Johnson is fascinating. Um, and you get not only the traditional portrait, which is hard to avoid because it seems like it was true. Lincoln was super level headed, just a good, salt of the earth guy. Um, but you see a different side where he's a collaborator, but also he was a powerful force. Even though he was nice and he would listen, he was a big man in spirit and also height. I mean, he would put his foot down with things and really assert himself, but he was also willing to listen and change. The book is the direct inspiration for the film starring Daniel Day-Lewis, for which he won his third Oscar, which you can have a movie night with dad afterwards or for yourself afterwards, and see how he did. I thought the movie was pretty good, but the book is just it. Number 5 seems maybe dismissive, but I'm also factoring in that a lot of people have read this book. I mean, I think it's sold over 1 million copies. Most of these people or most of these events that these books are about, there's a lot of books about all of them, right? Well, in the next book, number 4 is American Moonshot, JFK and the Great Space Race by Douglas Brinkley. Douglas Brinkley will probably prick the ears up of your inner dad or the dad you're giving this book to, because Douglas Brinkley wrote several books with Stephen Ambrose, who is of Band of Brothers fame. He also, Stephen Ambrose has an individually good one called Undaunted Courage about the Lewis and Clark expedition, which is really fun. Didn't make the list. Not quite long enough. American Moonshot tells the story of JFK, his rise to power, his complex vision for America that was really inspiring and a lot of people know in detail, but it comes at it from this space race angle and how JFK was so dedicated to increasing America's expertise in science, not just to beat the Russians as it's often portrayed, but also as a sense of a new frontier. And he felt that it was like Americans' duty to learn more and be leaders in thought and science. It's something that we're sadly far away from now. The book is really great. I mean, it'd make a great movie, and also it can kind of open up to a lot more doors. Brinkley has written tons of books. He's a rock star. I mean, he's a PhD professor. He's taught all over. I think he's at Rice now. He wrote a great book about Hurricane Katrina and the aftermath called The Great Deluge, which I highly recommend. He also has 3 big books that I call like his environmental trilogy. He has one about Teddy Roosevelt, which is called The Wilderness Warrior, and it's a biography of Roosevelt, but from the perspective of his environmental movements, Roosevelt's development of national parks. And after that, he's got one about Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, and kind of the same thing about conservation and moving things forward. And then he has another book that's more recent that's called The Silent Spring Revolution, and it focuses on JFK, LBJ, and Nixon afterwards in response to Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. So those 3 together, I mean, you're almost like 3,000 pages, but that's an environmental history of about 75 years of American history. That's just really fascinating. So again, American Moonshot, that's a great one. Any of the others would be good, but I think American Moonshot really, who doesn't love space and JFK? Number 8, I'm realizing I didn't read, and so hopefully I can edit this out. So with number 8, we've got a business book, but it's also a big biography, and it's called The Snowball, Warren Buffett and the Business of Life. This is written by Alice Schroeder, who was actually, I don't know if she was a vice president of Berkshire Hathaway, Buffett's company, but she was a high-level employee and became a close confidant of Buffett. So this is actually an authorized biography, the only one I think he's ever allowed. Buffett for a long time was the richest man in the world, strictly from investments and building his business. That he built a business by investing his own money and then buying a business that wasn't doing that well but had a lot of assets. Berkshire Hathaway, it was initially a mill in New England, in an era where mills were becoming a thing of the past, but they had a lot of assets and the books were good. So he actually bought it underpriced and was able to leverage the assets to buy other companies. And he built it into a snowball. So the book is not only telling the story of Warren Buffett's life, but it's also a kind of a primer on investment, compound interest. The snowball is a metaphor for compound interest, slowly rolling down the hill, investing and reinvesting and allowing things to build and living modestly. Buffett's a fascinating guy for someone so boring, is a fun way to put it. He's a very simple man in far as his tastes, but he also has complex things. Even though he's married or was married for a long time, he had essentially a lover with whom he had an entire second life. They all knew about each other, and it was just one of those things where you didn't get divorced. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And Schroeder got a lot of one-on-one participation in interviews with Buffett to talk about specific things as well as access to his life and papers. So it's really detailed. It's a big book. It's if you have an entrepreneurial side to you, or you just like investing, or Papa does, um, this book's really good. I've actually read this twice. I listened to it once and read it once, and it's really stuck with me. So for number 3, this isn't a biography. It's a history, but it's not a history that you're going to see on a lot of lists like this. It's A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. If you haven't heard of it or haven't read of it, you've probably heard the term A People's History, because this book kind of started the revolution for looking at history from the bottom up, from examining things from the everyday Americans. We read all these books about the Civil War, but we don't read a lot about how it affected the working class or the poor or the indigenous communities, etc. So People's History of the United States dates from the Columbus landing in the Caribbean to the Clinton era. There's stories about women's rights. There's stories about indigenous rights. There's historical events told from the perspective of workers and the working class, about unions, about union leaders, about civil rights leaders, and things like that. So it's really, at the time it came out, it was unheard of for a book like this, and it's really inspired a whole generation or more of social historians. And so now there's tons of people's histories of libraries, of people's histories of the world. It's become part of the jargon in history to look at things in that way. It's a really fascinating book, and you may recognize it from the movie Good Will Hunting. It's the book that Matt Damon's character, Will Hunting, says, you want a real book, read People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. That one will blow your hair back while he's smoking in Robin Williams' office. If your dad leans toward the right in any capacity, he might have problems with some of it. But I think the book, now that it's aged quite a bit, and we've kind of are familiar with a lot of these stories, I think it could be a good conversation starter, and it also can just kind of open people's eyes to whether you're right or left. The working class and the everyday man kind of always gets the shaft. For number 2, we go to Ukraine, but not the current war in Ukraine. We go to one of the worst environmental disasters of the Anthropocene, the modern era of humans making an impact on the world, and that is Chernobyl, when Ukraine was still part of the Soviet Union. This book is number 2, Midnight in Chernobyl by Adam Higginbotham. This book is so well written. It's so action packed. I felt like I was reading a Jack Reacher novel or a Tom Clancy novel. I mean, it's what led up to Chernobyl, what happened and why it was so bad, and the lingering aftermath for the people who live there, the people who were evacuated, and the people who were essentially forced by the bureaucratic institution of the USSR to sacrifice themselves, not only to clean up and try to save lives, but also sacrifice themselves and others to cover up this big mistake. Because a big inflated balloon like the USSR, any uh, aspirational or real superpower that's actually weak, has to appear strong. So a big part of the Soviet Union's success and hold of power over so many countries for so long, until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the piercing of the Iron Curtain, was the idea of their infallibility, the idea that the Soviet Union was perfect, the idea that the Soviet Union did nothing wrong. So when things started going wrong at Chernobyl and then the meltdown started, the higher ups would refuse to step in and allow the people in the plant or aware of what was going on to take the appropriate steps necessary to minimize the damage. So really, what could have been maybe not prevented completely, could have been stopped much sooner and not caused nearly as much damage, was made into the still happening natural and ecological disaster that was Chernobyl and the meltdown. The people who were exposed to this radiation weren't told to leave quick enough. When they were, they weren't given any answers. They weren't given any kind of treatment. Nobody was getting the appropriate protective personal equipment or any kind of things they could have done to prevent either death, long-term sickness, or long-term illness and birth defects. Again, that area, I mean, there are people living there now, but and some I guess never left. But the devastation that these people that were fleeing felt, they were being told nothing. They weren't allowed to ask questions or anything because of the, they had to minimize, even though everyone in the world learned quickly. I mean, scientists around the world could figure out the impacts very quickly of like how devastating this was within that bubble, within the USSR, within the Iron Curtain. Everything had to be hunky-dory and people had to keep going. It's a really, really fascinating book. And high up on my TBR is his most recent book, which came out I think 2 years ago. It's um, about a similar disaster and the devastation, but it's about an American one. It's about the Challenger space shuttle explosion. It's if it's anything like this one, it's going to be another 5-star book. Now, the moment you've all been waiting for, the number one book. Spoiler alert: it's about the Gulf of Mexico and the Gulf of Mexico area, which is near and dear to my heart as I live about 30 miles from the coast. It's Gulf: The Making of an American Sea by Jack Davis. This is won the Pulitzer Prize. It's a common theme here. It details the history and the relationship of the ocean itself with America and the foundations of America, particularly the Gulf of Mexico. So it starts pretty broad, but it stays pretty specific and it sweeps across the Gulf of Mexico, um, covering the early years when um, all the animals and all the plants were thriving before petroleum and petrochemical industries expanded, and the 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 deep south, particularly along the coast, became kind of a tossing ground for petrochemical exploitation. I mean, Louisiana today is still essentially a petrocolonial state. I mean, we give so many tax breaks and have so few regulations for commercial fisheries, for liquefied natural gas, rocket fuel, petroleum products, plastic products. All of these things, Louisiana and over into Texas as well, are covered in pipelines, orphan oil wells. And when you are down at the ocean of the Gulf of Mexico today, it's if you've never been to the coast of Louisiana, when you look out just in the distance past the brown near the coast, you can see the beautiful blue water, but you can also see dozens, if not hundreds, of oil rigs pumping away at not far off the coast. Um, this book talks about not only the history of America through the eyes of the ocean and the Gulf of Mexico, viewing the Gulf of Mexico as its own sea, which it is, even though it's part of the Atlantic Ocean. He talks about dolphins, which I'm working on a project about dolphins now. He talks about the near extinction of all these different species, like the brown pelican, the introduction of catastrophic dredging and other processes that are just really devastating for the coast, and how they're leading to the contemporary issues we're having with land loss. And it's just really a beautiful and fascinating book. If you're interested at all in oceanography, biology, environmental history, or coastal interactions, it's really a book that you're going to love, and I think your pops will love too. Well, I think that's 10, unless I've missed one. As always, I hope you found something in this video that tickles your fancy. You can add to the TBR, or if you haven't bought Dad something, you've got a couple days, maybe you can run down to your local bookstore, or if you have to, order it from the other place. As always, research is optional, but important.